I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey, everybody, Trish Wood here. And let me say this to our American listeners and listeners around the world. I am broadcasting to you today from Toronto, Canada. You know, it's Canada calling, like they used to say during the war, London calling. Send help. We are so screwed up here right now. I am telling you. I had planned on doing a show today about parental estrangement, which is a huge and terribly, terribly important story. It is wrecking our society and our culture. It's ruining families, and I think it's destroying children, and it's certainly destroying the parents that are being rejected and ghosted by young people who do not have the resilience to deal with complex familial relationships. It's a huge, huge, huge story. And as you people know, because I've been contacted by many, many of you in the last 3 years, some of these estrangements are being driven by cultural and political ideas. So if you didn't support Black Lives Matter, you're a racist and I can't be around you and neither can my kids. So see ya. You know, or you're not getting the vaccine. Wow, gotta go. You're a terrible person. Or, and if for the Americans, you voted for Trump, gone, not speaking to you. I mean, that's actually happening. And it's not like I'm going away for a week to collect my thoughts. Families are being blown apart by this idea. And I read somewhere it's like 1 in 5 families are now suffering some kind of an estrangement. So at the time we need our families most, they are being destroyed. And let me tell you what I mean by that, and then I'll move on to the other subject, which you guys all know I'm getting to, because I'm so mad. I got to get a minute before I can even talk about it. I'm so mad. I've been crying for 2 days. It is the siloization, I just invented that word, of our media sources. So as we say on this show, we all live in different realities depending on who we watch and how we curate our social media feeds. So kids are being told one pile of BS about topics and their parents are getting another pile, sometimes of BS on other topics. And we live in different worlds. So this is information, the outcome of information warfare, which I've been warning about on the show since I started it. I saw it happening. It is that. But here is the other piece of it. And this is what we're going to talk about today with Dr. Joshua Coleman. Stick around. Stick around. We are so lucky to have him. He is a hero in a profession where, in my professional opinion, as someone who has studied mistakes and trends in psychotherapy for decades and exposed some of them, he is a great hero. Dr. Coleman wrote a book called The Rules of Estrangement, which you must get and read, especially if this is happening to you. And he criticizes, as the other component in this, the way that psychotherapists are talking to their clients. So a kid comes in and says, oh, my mother's a narcissist and she's making me crazy and she's not supporting my truth and she's not, listening to my whatever. All the stuff young people talk about today as if it's important when actually it's really not. I know they think it's important, but there's more important things, like the fact your narcissistic mother would probably give you a kidney if you needed one, or take a bullet for you if such a thing were required. But that's not how we brought our kids up this way. So we also have a piece of this. But psychotherapists are advising young people to do this without doing any forensic analysis of if what they're saying is actually true or not. Is the parent actually a narcissist, or does this young person have other problems they're blaming on their parent? And that this estrangement or this ghosting isn't actually going to help because it's kind of a fake response to a problem that hasn't been properly identified. So Dr. Coleman is really good on that. And let me say, I guarantee it, that people who are going against the political grain in the kind of rolling tides of psychotherapeutic trends are not liked when they speak out. Elizabeth Loftus, who is an old friend of mine, was speaking out against recovered memory and satanic ritual abuse claims and a bunch of other stuff. Multiple personality disorder, right. And she ended up with bodyguards. Now, I don't think that's going to happen with Dr. Coleman, but I do admire people who have the courage to take on their profession. So let me just tell you quickly how I got onto this story. I sometimes will go down rabbit holes on YouTube. That's how boring my life is right now. And I clicked on a video, and it was a woman who'd ghosted her family, or no, she'd been ghosted by, I think, her daughter. And, it was just the emotional devastation was unbearable to watch. And then what happens on YouTube, as you may know, is that once you click on a certain topic, the algorithm at YouTube floods your YouTube zone on your own kind of home page with similar type videos. So over the next 3-4 days, I'm getting literally dozens of people who are either bragging about ghosting their parents, or parents who'd been ghosted and felt like they couldn't go on, or psychiatrists and therapists advising kids on how to ghost their parents. I thought, wow, I knew there was dissension because I hear from you people all the time. And I had my own son on at one point. He did relapse during COVID, and now he's great. And we talked about that, and we talked about how we resolved our own differences, because politically we couldn't be more different. And there was maybe a point where maybe he might have ghosted me if I'd kept pushing, but he's never going to think what I think, and that's fine. We talk about other stuff like the Toronto Raptors, who we mostly do agree on. So there are techniques, right, to avoid the estrangement, but I know that this phenomena is happening, but I didn't until I saw all these kind of algorithm curated YouTube videos, how massive of a cultural and societal phenomenon it is. And when I did, I will tell you, it hit me like a ton of bricks, because as you probably know, I'm quite sensitive about smelling danger for us right now. I'm really, really finely tuned to avenues that are opening up in our society that are not going to end well. And the failure of the family, the distancing of parents from children in informational silos with separate truths and separate beliefs, and no overarching kind of narrative about the validity of family life. This is, it's like it could be the end. Am I overstating it? I don't know. That's how it feels. And I feel so sorry for the people it's happened to. We opened up our little voice recorder on my website, trishwoodpodcast.com. And we got a couple of stories we're going to play when you hear from Dr. Coleman. And I swear to you, that's coming up. And that was supposed to be the show today. And then our House of Commons welcomed in and applauded a Ukrainian Nazi. I mean, it's one of those events that is so huge, so vile, so telling about what is going on with our political class right now, that there's almost no words to describe it. The only appropriate moral response, if indeed our leaders were moral and our elected officials actually cared more about doing the right thing than holding power, would have been some kind of an instant and heartfelt apology and mass resignations. But that didn't happen. It seems like our prime minister, who was cheering, and Chrystia Freeland, who was cheering and celebrating, the whole house was celebrating this guy. I mean, nothing's happened. And we've had 2 statements from Trudeau, both gaslighting, making each one worse than the last, not taking responsibility, and trying to blame the country instead of blaming himself. And he didn't even look concerned. Like, how could you? This is a country that the House Speaker, Rota, resigned over it, but nobody else has. And this is what I was going to say. I just had to pull myself together for a minute because I was getting upset. I'm still upset. The guy they honored was a guy who was part of a Ukrainian unit that was fighting against Russia. His name is Yaroslav Hunka. The speaker said in the House before they jumped up like clapping seals that he'd been fighting the Russians. And you can actually see in that video that he hesitated for a minute, because in that minute, the speaker understood, as should every single person in that House, from the lowest page up to the highest, well, up to our prime minister and every MP in between. Russia was an ally. If Mr. Hunka was fighting the Russians, he was fighting with the Nazis. He was fighting with the Nazis. So what is the worst crime of a cascading series of crimes exemplified by what happened in the Canadian House of Commons? What is it? Is it that this guy wasn't vetted? I don't believe he wasn't vetted, because you know what? Somebody posted on Twitter today a photograph of him in his wheelchair, and it's one of his family members saying they were waiting to meet the Prime Minister and I believe Chrystia Freeland before the House. Did nobody ask him where he fought and who he fought? No. Plus, Rhoda knew it. He knew where he fought. He said it. He said it. He said it. He said that the guy they were cheering for was fighting against our allies. When he said Russia, that's what he was saying. They can't get out of it. They can't get out of this. They can't weasel out. The Prime Minister can't weasel out. Did the Prime Minister know when Rhoda said that, or when he met him, that Russia was on our side? That 26 million Russian troops and civilians died as a result of their support for the Allied fight against the Nazis in the Second World War? Does our Prime Minister know that? Because if he does know that, then he knew he was applauding a Nazi. If he didn't know that, he should resign because he doesn't know his own history, and that is an insult to every single veteran who fought in that war, including my father, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's beyond mind-boggling. It is probably, in my view, and I think many Canadians agree with me on this, the worst thing that's ever happened in that room. And then they compound it. This is another kind of replay of COVID weirdness too. They do one weird thing and then they keep doing weirder things. That there haven't been resignations, that the media is saying, it's not so bad. They're doing that. They're saying, it's not so bad. Why are they doing that? This is a country where a Nazi flag kind of shows up way on the periphery of the trucker convoy. A person the truckers didn't know, someone the truckers never spoke to, very likely a plant, I believe from the Prime Minister's office, but I'm guessing. And the whole bunch of people who went to protest vaccine mandates were called Nazis by the media and by our Prime Minister. I didn't see Tamara Leach and Chris Barber or BJ Dichter or Tom Marazza or any of those guys applauding the Nazi or neo-Nazi. Hunka was it was with a unit that killed Jews, according to something I'm going to read you later. So where are we in this country now? Are we just going to move on? Is this just the latest horror to be perpetrated upon us by our government? And because the media is protecting him, we just move on? Oops. Because if we do that, let not another person who was in that august building ever be allowed to lay a wreath on a monument for the soldiers who died on Juno Beach or anywhere else. They're not allowed to do that anymore. Don't let them do it, because you know what? It's all a fraud. They don't even know what happened there. They don't even know who was fighting who. Now, I'm not saying the Ukrainians were at Juno Beach, but I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. I'm saying it's an insult to all of our veterans. And of course, to our Jewish brothers and sisters. Of course, of course, of course. But is this just going to stand now? I know that the Prime Minister, or I've read that the Prime Minister said, oh, just, don't make any statement about it. It'll blow over, because everything blows over now. And every country in the West, when governments do something boneheaded or get caught stealing or get caught doing something irreparably misbegotten, they know that the news cycle will move on, because we do not have a legitimate legacy media right now doing accountability. So it is so bad that in a Western government's House of Commons, an actual Nazi is applauded and celebrated by everybody. I think maybe one person didn't in the building. And they all survive it? I mean, politically, they survive it? Really? What is the low bar here then? What's the low bar? What do you have to do in the House of Commons as a politician in this country before it's so shaming and terrible that you've got to hang your head and go home? What do you have to do? I thought, if somebody had asked me that 2 weeks ago, I would have said, well, applauding a Nazi would probably, that would be bad. That would probably, get you resigning and sent home on the next one smoking, as they say, right? But no, they're surviving it. They're surviving it. There are a few people who are nailing this, not just for the so-called mistake that was made, but the moral and historical ramifications of what happened. We can't forget our history, people. We can't. So here's how I plotted the show today. I was going to do parental estrangement, and then this happened, and I thought, well, maybe I'll book somebody to talk about this. But then when I sat down to write about about what Trudeau had done and what the House of Commons had done, I started writing about my dad, who'd been in the Canadian Navy and came back damaged, like apparently many, many other guys did. He was 17 and he came back from the horrors of the North Atlantic and never talked about it. But we had some pretty good intel that, his pretty broken personality and alcoholism and other terrible things were as a result of his service there. And I wrote about it on Substack, and God bless all of you who included stories about your own dads they all went at 17. They lied and they shipped out in the Canadian Navy at the age of 17. Imagine that. Into the meat grinder of World War II. Oh my God. So that leaves generational harm, right? I believe, and maybe next generation after mine will be less crazy and broken because of things that happened in the war. But that's what happens. It's true. It's true. So I had a new version in my head of my dad, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But if you want to see that, I wrote about it on Substack. If you have stories about your own family members, particularly your fathers or your grandfathers, being kind of screwed up after World War II and coming home and not being able to cope, that manifested itself in a lot of scary ways in Canadian homes. And I'm glad we're talking about it. So keep talking about it, because we do have PTSD. That phrase, I believe, came out of the Vietnam War. We did not deal with the mental trouble of soldiers back in the day. 1 minute they're in the fourth ring of Wagnerian hell, And the next minute they're back on a farm in Alberta having to cope with what they saw, and nobody wants to talk about it, and they didn't want to talk about it. And then, okay, raise a family now, get a job and raise a family. That's what happened across the country. And it damaged a lot of people. We all paid a bit of a price for World War II and the heroism of our relatives. So I feel like I've got a little bit of skin in the game here. And I think you guys all do too. And, you know, the other thing is, Trudeau did not apologize to our veterans either. He didn't. So, yeah. So we're going to go into parental estrangement, because I was estranged from my dad. I had such a difficult childhood. There was a point where, for kind of self-preservation, I fled and worked really hard and became a famous journalist. But there was always something a little bit wrong with me. And as I will say to Dr. Coleman, I do regret that I didn't find more resilience to be kinder to him, my father. So we're going to talk about that too. With Dr. Coleman. So it all kind of gelled together, this outrageous performance by our government and the people we elect, and the idea that kids ghost their parents, and maybe we should look at some other ways to manage broken parents too. And that is to build resilience. So we talk about that. I'm going to go now to just my little pitch. And then when we come back, I'm going to play Neil Oliver. You're going to notice today I'm not playing the clapping for Mr. Hunka. I'm not playing Trudeau's. They weren't even apologies. His PR spins about it, because I can't hear any of it today. I just can't. And I'm not going to inflict it on you guys either. But what I am going to play is Neil Oliver from the UK, who's a very, very learned and thoughtful guy, saying, in a sense, how I think maybe we all feel about it, but he says it way better than I ever could. So let me do my pitch, then we'll hear from Neil, and then we'll go into our interview with Dr. Coleman about this growing phenomenon. So as you know, the podcast and the Substack, Trish Wood is Critical, are endeavors into critical thinking at a time when thinking is corrupted by ideology and propaganda and basically lies. We're lied to about a lot of stuff, actually, these days. So my little part of the world is about using what I learned as an investigative journalist, and may I say, a pretty good one, to help you wade through, I guess, these really, really difficult times. So I do a podcast once a week, sometimes twice when I can. I do a Substack once a week, sometimes more when I can. I post the show on the Substack when I can. I missed a couple, but this one is going to be there for sure, because I know you're going to want to comment on it. And we're building a very good community there. So my funding source is Substack, because it is purely a free speech platform, and they are rolling them back. GB News is in a lot of trouble right now. They're, the night of the long knives, they are out for GB News because Lawrence Fox made a dumb joke. And of course, on the Dan Wooten show, so I think Dan Wooten is gone, at least temporarily, and all of the hyenas in the BBC and elsewhere who want to shut GB News down are circling Ofcom, the kind of regulator of news. Imagine that. In the UK is also circling. So it's a very bad time. Remember, they kicked off Mark Stein as well, who was doing a great job. So these are dangerous times. And that's why I've chosen Substack, because it seems pretty steadfast. So when you're supporting my Substack, you are supporting the podcast and all of my other endeavors, one of which has been trying to cover at least a little bit the trial of Tamara Leach and Chris Barber down in Ottawa, which is on a hiatus right now, but I will be back soon. So please do that. My website is trishwoodpodcast.com. You can learn a little bit about me and my background. I was the host of a big CBC show called Fifth Estate for 10 years, back when that meant something. I always add that. And I have a Twitter account too, which is Atwood Reporting, where we get kind of rowdy within reason. And I have an Instagram too. I have a wonderful helper producer named Dorothea, and also Steve and his wife Christine are wonderful producers for me. So there's a lot of people working on this show. Well, there's 4 of us. And so any contribution you may choose to make to this information stream is very, very much appreciated. And I do try to be as neutral and objective as I can. And when I make mistakes, I admit them. That's it for that. Here is one of my favorite commentators. His name is Neil Oliver. We're not going to listen to the whole thing. It's quite long, but I'm going to give you a good snippet of it. So settle in with his totally appropriate, completely justified horror at what just happened in our House of Commons. This is how the world views us, people. This is how imagine can you imagine if this happened in London or some other Western country, that like an actual Nazi was getting cheered on and then like nothing happened as a result? I mean, I can't even believe I'm saying that. Anyway, here is Neil Oliver from London.
I would say that evil grows, first of all, in the darkness. And that sometimes that's the literal dark of shadows and night time and, I don't know, windowless rooms. But it's also the darkness of ignorance. And you might say the darkness of forgetting. But to be honest, that's to put a positive spin on it that I'm not sure it deserves. What just happened in the Canadian Parliament was that a 98-year-old man called Jaroslav Hunka, a man who fought for the Waffen-SS, the most feared and evil part of the Nazi war machine. He fought for the Nazis, and therefore against the Allies, meaning against Canada, against the United States of America, against Britain, against France, the whole lot during World War II. But Hunka was introduced as a soldier and as a hero who had fought against the Russians. He was to be celebrated for having fought the Russians in World War II. We fought alongside the Russians in World War II, as did Canada and the United States of America and all the Allies, the Allied powers. Canada took a disproportionately heavy hit in World War II. Thousands and thousands of her soldiers were killed fighting Nazis on the beach at Juno, the Normandy beach that was the objective of the Canadian element of the landings on Normandy. And they came up against the Waffen-SS, which was in part why they took such a terrible hit on that day and many days thereafter. And in terms of per head of population, Canada was among the most hurt by the war, the most hurt by fighting Nazis. But there, in that parliament, Hunka was given a standing ovation in front of the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, in front of the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, who saluted Hunka with an upraised fist. And he was given that ovation by the entire parliament, to a man, to a woman, government and opposition. You watch it open-mouthed, really. And Trudeau, for whom I lack the words adequately to describe his despicable nature, Trudeau has said it was, quote, extremely upsetting. And he has, well, let's say, allowed the Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, to take the blame. As though it was all down to him. As though that which happens in front of the entire House of Commons in the Canadian Parliament isn't checked with the Prime Minister's office. That nothing moves in that space without the Prime Minister and his office being forewarned of it and having to give it the okay. But Trudeau has said, I mean, it's unbelievable. He has said it was embarrassing for all Canadians, thereby somehow spreading the blame to every citizen of his country. including, obviously, descendants of veterans of the war who bled and died fighting Nazis. And their Prime Minister is inviting them now to share the blame for the celebration and standing ovation that was given to a Nazi in that place. Trudeau even had the gall to note that it happened on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is in the Jewish calendar, it's the holiest of holy days. There is no day that means more in the Jewish calendar than Yom Kippur. And you wonder, surely that's a 1 in 365 chance that such an abhorrence would happen on the eve of Yom Kippur. And then somehow Trudeau segued into the need to fight Russian propaganda and misinformation. He didn't even draw breath. You know, was he implying that the SS nonagenarian, a literal Nazi, was given a standing ovation by the entire Canadian Parliament as a consequence of Russian propaganda? I mean, how exactly are the Russians supposed to be implicated in the events that unfolded in that place on that day? The point is about, at best, ignorance. Is it possible that all those parliamentarians had forgotten or somehow never knew that Canada and the rest of the Allies were on the same side as the Russians in World War II and fighting against Nazis like Yaroslav Hunka? Is that possible? I have to ask the question, because that would appear to be what we are being expected to accept as the explanation for that tableau.
He totally nails it, doesn't he? I mean, it's unbelievable. Are we hearing that kind of commentary here from legacy media who are scrambling to play this down? This is the new low. Our media is playing down a Nazi in the House of Commons and all of the horror that represents. I am gobsmacked. Anyway, as you know. So I just want to add to that at the end of my interview with Dr. Coleman that you must listen to. It is an astonishing expose of this terrible trend that is tearing families. And in fact, I think in the end, it will tear our country and our lives apart. We can't stand without families. It's not good. We got to figure it out. I'm going to read you an article that I found that is absolutely terrifying. And it kind of proves that it's very, very likely that people in our government in Ottawa knew very well who this guy was. I'm not just fooling around here, people. I have an article, solid reporting, that they knew who this guy was. Here's the headline. Canadian government comes to the defense of Nazi SS and Nazi collaborators, but why? This is written by David Pugliese, Ottawa Citizen in 2018. So this government, Trudeau's government, has been up to this for a while. And this article has the receipts, and I'm going to read it to you when I finish up with Dr. Coleman and his extraordinary thoughts about parental estrangement. He's really an expert. And we are also going to hear in the interview from a couple of listeners who phoned in and left messages about their own experience with it. And let me just say, we chose these two. We got a lot, and I listened to them all, and my heart bleeds for you. So let's talk about parental estrangement. And also you'll hear me talking about my father, because this whole situation did, as I was writing about it, bring up my own estrangement from him and my deep regret about that in my old age. I wish I'd had more resilience. And that is what Dr. Coleman is going to be talking about. So here is my interview with Joshua Coleman. Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Great. I'm so glad to have you on today, because I have been involved in covering many other things in the last few years, and I, of all the things, have missed this estrangement stuff that's going on. And I'll tell you how it kind of fell into my lap. I was on YouTube watching something. I clicked on a woman who was ghosting her parents and explaining why she was doing it and how to do it. And it was instructional. And as you know, probably like most people, I didn't know this, but then once you click on something, YouTube curates everything in your feed. So all I got was estrangement videos from people, from psychiatrists and therapists saying, this is how you do it or don't do it. People saying, I've done it. I want to do it. How do I do it? There were so many of them. I thought, what is going on here? And then of course I started Googling around and I found some articles, some of which you were in. So let me just begin by asking you very bluntly, what the hell is going on here?
Well, I think a bunch of things are going on. I think we've got rising rates of individualism in Western societies. I think we've got leading to the increasing atomization of this tribalization. People are being pitted more against each other. We have social media, which can serve as, on the one hand, a positive source of information and support. On the other hand, a kind of an unhinged kin that can support anybody's worst instincts. I think there's a big social contagion factor to estrangement, where things that were might have been considered more abhorrent or wrong or immoral in earlier generations. I mean, one of the things parents always say to me is, look, a lot of us didn't even like our parents, but the idea of cutting a parent off was just not something any of us would have considered. So now it just becomes something that's considered reasonable, not only possible, but a good, powerful thing to do.
Yeah. See, I probably disagree, but you can change my mind whether it's a good thing to do. And I'll tell you, I'll tell you just one quick interesting story. We had, as you heard in the pre-chat, this Nazi event in our House of Commons, which got everybody thinking about all kinds of terrible things. And it reminded me of my poor doomed alcoholic father, who'd been a Navy signalman and who'd literally fought the Nazis but had paid a very high price in his mental health. Yeah. And my childhood was very difficult, and I did the estrangement thing as soon as I could get the hell out of there. Yeah. And I regret it now. I wish I'd had the resilience and the tools to maybe have more grace about who he was and why he behaved the way he did. Yeah. What do you think of that? Talk to me about that.
No, I think you're right. I appreciate your personal example, and I wish that people had that as well. And my concern about the popular narrative, of which we therapists are really major contributors to, is this idea that, if somebody's stressing you out or crossing your boundaries or gaslighting you, then not only can you cut them out, but you should cut them out. And not only does it make us more atomized as a society, we have rising rates of mental illness, but it also doesn't really encourage people to work through the things that they're better off working through. In cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about the importance of turning toward the thing that you feel the most anxious and upset about. And that's probably the hardest thing to do with a parent, because parents still occupy a fairly large chunk of real estate in our minds, even once they're gone. So it's no small task, but a lot of value can come from that. I mean, one of the big things that's happening now that greatly concerns me is that when an adult child cuts off a parent, they're also cutting off access to the grandchildren. Yes. And so whole generations that are being fractured as a result of this.
See, that's very, very scary to me. And the other thing I just want to say too, my observation of this, because it hit me very hard when I realized how widespread it's becoming. And I am a big believer in the family, and families aren't perfect. They're never what we want them to be or think they are, actually. No. Right. So what was the idea that, am I just an old fart to say kids today have an unrealistic view of what to expect? In other words, I hear a lot of, my truth. They didn't let me speak my truth. They weren't, they weren't like affirming who I am. And I don't mean that in a trans sense, but like my even good parents didn't do that 20 or 30 years ago.
Oh gosh, no.
Right.
No.
So,
right.
So is the expectation too great now, do you think, from kids?
It is. It's too great. And that has to do with the way that there's been a profound shift in the culture over the past half century away from honor thy mother and thy father, to a much more of a preoccupation with mental health, with much more with identity, with self-esteem, with personal growth. And from that vantage point, we're involved in what the British sociologist Anthony Giddens refers to as pure relationships. The relationships are only engaged in or sought after to the extent that they purely are in line with our ideals for intimacy and happiness and personal growth. Anything else we should get rid of. And I just think an enormous disservice is being done to older generations as a result of it, but also to younger generations, because they're cutting themselves off from people who love them and care about them and are dedicated to them, however flawed that is in their engagement.
Very interesting, because just to follow up on what you said, there is also, it would seem anyway, a lack of willing to confront adversity as a positive thing.
Yeah.
Everything can't be nice every minute of the day, people.
No.
And adversity, for me, as I said, I had a pretty crummy childhood, but I probably would trade it, but on other days I might not trade it. You know, I am who I am, and it's kind of working for me right now. So it's like we coddling of the American mind, this book I'm thinking of right now. I'm sure you read it, right?
No, I have read it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think Heitz and Lukianov's analysis is very much true. That parents, I mean, I'm a boomer, and parents of our generation were very concerned, in part because there was this radical shift away from help by businesses and government starting in the 1980s. You know, we had this great period in the post-war period until the mid-1970s where both governments and businesses give enormous help to parents and to workers, and for medical care, for insurance, for college education. And all that began to go away in the 1980s. So as a result of that, evolved the helicopter parenting, intensive parenting. And so our generation of parents as boomers, and to some extent Gen X, and continuing into the present, have become much more anxious, much more guilt-ridden, much more surveilling. And there evolves what Haidt refers to as safetyism, the idea that the most important thing is to make sure that your child is not only safe, but that they're really inculcated with the values so that they have sufficient social capital to get into the world and make do of themselves. The problem is that they're not really being exposed to the hardships of life in a way that actually is the one thing that builds resilience.
Resilience is the word. Yeah. You know, just speaking personally again, my grandfather was a kind of a crabby old Finnish boat builder, commercial fisherman, and a legend on the BC coast.
Oh, wow.
Really tough person in good ways, and built a marina and had a boat building business and stuff. But he was a man of few words. Let me tell you that. But I loved him. And the idea that, going down to the marina when he was gassing up a boat that had come in from the Nelson Brothers Fishery Company and getting a Coke out of that cold machine was all the validation I needed from him. And I loved him desperately. The idea that he was going to sit around and talk about my issues with me is ridiculous. But we don't seem to be able to love people who aren't involved somehow in our psychic stuff anymore.
Yeah, well, there's such a strong call to identity that you have to recognize who I am and my feelings and my gender and my political beliefs. And that's true not only on the left, but on the right as well. And that if you're not doing that, then somehow you're being abusive and offensive. And it's just very wrongheaded and very problematic. And, it's not surprising we have rising rates of mental illness in the West, because if this is how we're defining intimacy and engagement, well, we're all kind of screwed.
Well, it's kind of trauma bonding then. Everybody's just trauma bonding,
exactly.
Right. I want to get into some of the stuff that we're seeing, because I think it's really important. But from your perspective, how can we, in a sort of a more global sense, societally, put a stop to this? Because I bet this isn't happening in Japan or India or other cultures where there's a lot more pressure on kids to just kind of respect their parents and be quiet, for ill or good. That cannot be a good thing too. But globally in Western cultures where this is happening, How should we be viewing it? I mean, is it a threat to the family? Because it sure feels like one to me. I'm frightened by this.
Well, it is a threat to the family, and there's other threats to the family as well. But for example, in the United States, 40% of children today are being born without marriage. And the big danger, I mean, I don't have a problem with that because in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, that's true as well. But those families are much more likely, those parents are much more likely to stay together than married parents are in the U.S. So it's not so much marriage per se, it's more marriage, at least in America, in the United States, as an indicator of long-term commitment. And most, in the U.S., non-marital childbirth is very likely to result in a father not having any contact with their children within 3 to 5 years. And so a recent statistic showed that 1 out of 4 fathers has no relationship with their children in the U.S.
Wow.
That's devastating and horrible. And, sometimes it's because the fathers just disappear. Sometimes it's because the mother gatekeeps. There's a number of different reasons why that occurs, but it's tragic and it's a serious social problem.
Have you figured out the mechanism through which absent fathers is bad for kids? I mean, what is it about having a male parent in the household or regularly around and engaged that makes kids better? What is it?
Yeah, well, I think fathering is different than mothering. Fathers tend to have less guilt about their authority, less conflict about it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
A lot of the cross-cultural studies show that fathers are much more likely to expose their children to risk. One of the common things is that when a father carries a newborn or a toddler under their arm, they do it facing the world, whereas a mother does it facing her and facing her close to her heart. So there are these very different orientations that men and women bring to the world. And fathers, because they have a clear sense of their authority, they don't have as much guilt about using their authority, so they're a good role model, but they're also a good container, particularly of, children who need kind of a tighter rein. Like my wife and I have twin boys, and I have a daughter from a prior marriage, and my wife and I, one of our boys was very, rambunctious and oppositional. And we both have said, if I hadn't been there to kind of keep the rein on him,
Yeah.
it would have been a really difficult. He was he was a great kid, but he was challenging.
Yeah.
But he kind of needed me to kind of I had no guilt about the use of my authority, whereas my wife was much more worried about it and anxious about it and, conflicted about using her authority. So I think that's a big contribution. And there's other contributions as well.
But this, I think, of all times maybe not all times, but in recent memory, this is not a good time for the family to be going through these big problems because there's so much division around almost every issue right now. On this show, we talk about being, people curate their own social media feeds. We don't even live in the same world anymore. If I'm watching my news shows and curating my feeds and you're watching your news show, we have a totally different view of truth and reality, in fact. And I can't help but feel, I read this piece, I think it's from the BBC, and you're mentioned in it actually, about where part of this estrangement now is coming from cultural and political differences, which really frightens me because we can't disagree with someone politically now without thinking they're a terrible, rotten, and immoral person, right?
It's true. Yeah, there was an Ipsos poll in the U.S. in 2016 that showed that 16% of families have become estranged over politics. And politics has become a much more powerful kind of value indicator than it was 15, years or so ago. 15 or so years ago, somebody said, my kid's going to marry somebody from the opposite party. Parent might feel, well, it's not my preference, but okay, as long as they love them, that's all I care about.
Yeah.
Now that person would be considered a real serious problem. And there may be becoming an estrangement over that. So yeah, we're becoming divided over all kinds of things in a really, really worrisome way.
What do you say? There's this story in this article, and then we're going to play a couple of audio tapes we have from our listeners. But there was one about this heated guy named Scott. It's maybe a fake name, who cut off all contacts with his parents in 2019. And I think he was accusing her of racism or something. And, she said a lot of really racist things. And with his 7-year-old son in earshot. So let's just park the racist things. Who knows what she actually said? If in fact they were racist, maybe it's just the new generation's version that if you challenge Black Lives Matter or something, all of a sudden you're, a terrible person. You're not allowed nuance, right?
Right.
So let's just accept that that's what he thought, rightly or wrongly. What would you say if he were your patient or client, I guess? What would you say to him about that relationship? How would you talk to him about it?
Well, I would want him to know how he's thinking about it in terms of his own child, because pretty consistently, if a adult child cuts off the parent, then they're also blocking access to the grandchildren. Occasionally, that's not the case, but as a rule, that's the case. So, and often these are very loving, involved grandparents, even by the now estranged adult child's admission. The problem is then they fold that into their own identity and say that, well, if it's not good for me, it's not good for my children. And if it upsets me, then it upsets my children. Well, that's really just simply not true. I mean, I guess, yes, if every time you talk to your parent, you go into a rage, and you're out of control, and you start screaming at the top of your lungs, right. But if that's the case, then you need to get your butt into therapy, not just cut off your parent. So, I mean, my philosophy, because of my training in cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's not just that, but it's one of the things that I've been trained in, is that you're better off facing people that you have conflict with and talking about it with them and talking it through with them. But talking it through doesn't mean that you're going to persuade them. If somebody, particularly around politics, it's highly unlikely you're going to persuade that person that they're wrong and that you're right. So the old ideas about, and I don't want to be too nostalgic here, but there is a lot of value to earlier generations who had the value of going along to getting along, or not talking about politics or sex or other things, with families, if they are going to be too problematic.
See, that's interesting, because that you're really highlighting what I believe this is the new thing. And I've seen it a bit in my own relationship with my son even. And I had him on the show and we talked about it because we found a way to navigate it. But he is, I would use the word super woke just because it's lazy and I can't think of a better way to put it. But we and I'm more nuanced because my background is as an investigative journalist. So I can support people protesting George Floyd without buying everything that happened. I can critique the riots without not caring about George Floyd. Sure. But what happened around that event in particular was very, very divisive. And anybody who did try to raise a nuanced position, especially from young people, that was terrible. And he thought I was being this racist person. My issue actually was, it was the Jacob Blake case, because Jacob Blake was wanted for sexually assaulting a woman, and he actually did have a knife. And I was upset that he was being heroified in this pantheon of people who'd been shot by the police, although he didn't die. And I think you should be allowed to do that, right? You care about the details. But he and a basketball player this is so silly, a basketball player from the Toronto Raptors, where I live, was wearing a Jacob Blake Black Lives Matter shirt. And I was like, man, that really, as a woman, boy, I really feel we're the bottom of the kind of identity politics ladder, because he was a really bad guy to women, Yeah. And so there was a bit of an accusation from my oldest kid. And I finally had to turn to him and say, you've known me my whole life as an investigative journalist exposing racism. I totally social justice warrior in the olden times, actual liberal way, in my view. And how can you now think that I'm a monster? We got to move past that. And that's what frightens me about the dialogue and the parentalist. We did move past it because he's pretty smart, but that's what scares me, Josh, is the idea that a person is demonized if you are not repeating the talking points that are approved in certain circles right now.
Yeah, and I think, to go back to your earlier point, this is especially true in Western societies where identity, self-esteem, individuation, separation, autonomy are such powerful values. In Asian societies, for example, that isn't the case, where it's much more the idea of collaboration and interdependence are much more important. But today in Western societies, particularly, in American cultures, the idea that your identity is the single most important thing, and anything that in any way goes against that, or anybody whose values are at odds with yours, that not only, can you confront them, but you should confront them, and that associating with them in some way is going to contaminate you and your values, has just become the new norm in this very problematic way.
How do we fight that? What do we do about it?
Well, hopefully these kinds of dialogues help. I'm trying to do more and more writing for a general audience on this topic. I'm doing a lot of training for therapists that people can access either through my website. In a couple of weeks, I'm doing one at UC Irvine for the faculty, because therapists are actually a big problem. Therapists are not separate from the larger culture of Western individualism. And so therapists can become more like litigious attorneys fighting for the rights of their clients without really thinking several generations down the line. We become what the sociologist Alison Pugh refers to as detachment brokers, helping people detach from the feelings of guilt or responsibility that might have animated them in earlier generations. And so I think therapists are really kind of the dividing line here. And because there's too many therapists just going along with the idea that, yes, you should cut your parent out, and that's a good idea, and that's a sign of your self-esteem, being self-protective and not being codependent. And a lot of that is just unmitigated crap, and it's kind of really tearing our societies apart.
I am so glad you said that. Wow, that's really a brave thing for you to say, because I bet a lot of people don't like that you say that. Right?
No, they don't. Therapists in particular, but I don't give a damn. I mean, we need to call a spade here, and therapists are way too easy to just support. I mean, I did it too when I was an early therapist, because you sort of assume that you're just supposed to support the person who's sitting in the room. But the more, I've been doing this now for 45 years as a therapist, and the longer you do it, the more you see that what people really want from you is honest, hard truths, the truths that nobody else is telling them. So, for example, I used to have somebody who's going to get divorced, and they'd say, "Well, it's going to be okay for my kids." I used to say, "Oh yeah, as long as you guys communicate well." It's kind of, and now my attitude is like, well, hopefully we don't know. Some children do terrible as a result of a divorce. Worse, from my training and research as a psychologist, your kids may not end up talking to one or both of you as a result of it. A divorce is an enormous risk for a later estrangement. So I'm just very honest and blunt with parents about that in that way, not in a moralizing way, just kind of like in a sort of physicianly way, sort of like, well, yeah, this is a possibility. It may all work out, but all therapeutic advice is probabilistic in nature. So that's where I come from. Boy,
you are really radical. It's so great. No, I'm loving this. I'll get back to the estrangement, but I did see, this is probably a bridge too far and you'll hate me for saying it, but I'm going to take a chance here. But
go for it.
I did see an interview with a woman who I guess she's probably written off as a conservative now. I'd never heard of her before, but she did an interview and a show about how daycare is a really bad idea, and how maybe we should delay working, which is, I know it's really kind of like regressive idea, but that daycare is that great. And here's what I thought. It had a ring of truth, even though I'm a card-carrying feminist. It had a ring of truth. And I kind of knew, in a sense, it was true, because with my first kid, I was working like mad and trying to make a mark as a journalist in a very high-profile situation. And then my other kid is 17 years different, and I was much more laid back and stayed home for 6 years. And it was a completely different experience. And being with him in the park near my house with the nannies, with the other kids, dare I say it, women will be jumping out of buildings, but the nannies weren't as nice to the babies as I was to my baby. It's just different, right? So we, at some point, we have to start telling the truth. It doesn't mean there should be no daycare or no one should ever have a nanny, but we have to, I think, be much more realistic and honest about what's maybe being lost there, both for the mother and the baby.
Well, right. And in some cultures, particularly in Europe, there's much more attention and help from the government. For example, my daughter married a French man, and she lived in France for a while, and they were in the States. They went there. I mean, she immediately was able to enroll my grandson in a really high quality school with free lunch, and the lunches were amazing.
Yeah.
And all this was free, right? Whereas for here, if you went to a good small school with lunch, I mean, you'd be spending college level education for it. So in North American cultures, and some Western democracies, but particularly, I think in Canada, you guys are better than we are, but in the U.S. in particular, we do a terrible job of supporting families in terms of even providing childcare or giving parents the option of staying home if they needed to. There's just no support for it.
Yeah, no, we're getting better at it, but Canada's also a little bit collapsing right now. It's not good what's happening here. But let's, you talked about the idea of social contagion, and I want to really get your opinion on these YouTube videos, because I went down the rabbit hole, which is why I'm doing this show. There were many videos, both of professionals and of people who'd done it, encouraging it like mad. And it made me really also understand that psychotherapy, or whatever we're calling it these days, I'm not sure what the correct word is, but or counseling, whatever, is actually, it's not investigative, is it? It's not a fact finding. And maybe it should be more fact finding. I don't know, but what do you think of that?
Well, I just think that therapists are just too oriented towards making the person who's sitting before them feel better. But I think the larger problem is just that therapists aren't really separate from the larger culture of individualism. So the ideas of separation and individuation and autonomy are so prized. There's a great sociologist at the University of Massachusetts, Amy Shalit, wrote an important book called Not Under My Roof. And she's a Dutch American. I think she has dual citizenship. She's born in Holland. And so she compares Dutch parenting practices with American. And the American parenting practices she refers to as a form of adversarial individualism, which is the idea that you become an adult in an adversarial relationship to your parent. And I think that too often therapists are facilitating that process, that standing up to your parent, cutting them off, having boundaries, et cetera. I mean, those are all valuable things. But when it comes to cutting them off completely and ending the relationship, or participating in diagnosing a parent that you've never met, that's a serious problem.
And do Harry and Meghan come into discussions around this? Because they seem to be, in a way, the poster children for ghosting your family, right? It's not a good look.
No, it's not a good look. And no, I get interviewed about them a fair amount. They're probably the most famous family that have done that. And you hear Harry talking about his traumas, and now, because of his therapy, he's working through his traumas, and he's not going to pass on his traumas to his children. And, he lost a mother at a very young age. I would consider that a trauma. But I also think a lot of things are getting called traumas today that they're not traumas. They're just difficult parts of living. Mary Carr, who wrote The Liars Club, said that what's a dysfunctional family? It's a family with more than one person in it. Uncomfortable feelings, hurt feelings, disappointments, failures of in attunement from parents. Those aren't traumas. They're not life altering. Parenting, however important, forms a relatively small part of who we become. Equally and sometimes more important are genetics, social class, neighborhood, random good luck, random bad luck. The research of Jean Twenge at San Diego State, wrote her recent book called Generations, shows that the generation that you're born into is much more predictive of whether you're going to have anxiety if you're a young person than family dysfunction. So all these,
really, wow.
It's fascinating. So all these other factors go into creating a self and an adulthood, but therapists are still under the sway of this whole idea that who you are as a result of hidden traumas. And this is part and parcel of where we are today. The Israeli sociologist Eva Illouz has this saying that what's a dysfunctional family? It's a family where your needs weren't met. How do you know your needs weren't met? By looking at your present condition. And the reason I love that statement, because I think it so summarizes where we are today. The idea that, well, I have depression, I have anxiety, I have intimacy issues. Oh, well, what I need to do is look back and find my traumas. And once I've found my traumas, then I'll be able to be a new person. And maybe I'll need to cut out some people to become that person. But that's what I need to do. And that's kind of pulling this all apart, that whole ideation.
The cutting out of people, even that phrase is all, I mean, it sounds very kind of Woody Allen-ish, right? Because, not exactly the poster boy for mental health, and nor is Harry, actually, if you look at what he's doing.
Yeah.
And there's a joke about him when he was accused of molesting one of his kids. And somebody said, well, it can't be happening because he's been in therapy once a week for like 30 years. And the joke is, well, just think how bad it would be if he was in therapy twice a week or something like that. But it's like some awful Woody Allen joke. But the cutting off of people and the blaming always of your parents or what happened in your past for the way you are now, it's also it bespeaks helplessness too, that you can't overcome these things and build the resilience that we all so desperately need if you're sitting around like Harry and Meghan are doing, blaming everybody else and not getting on with their lives. Right.
It's a lionization of vulnerability and a certain kind of victimhood approach to reality and identity that is kind of antithetical to the idea that we're inherently resilient. I mean, to return to the topic of traumas, I mean, traumas are a real thing. I'm not in any way belittling somebody who's experienced molestation or physical abuse or abject neglect, or many other ways that somebody can be traumatized. But the research shows that only 10% of those people go on to have long-term PTSD unless they've had repeated traumas or really severe traumas. But then still, it's only 25% that go on to have long-term problems. So this whole idea that if you've been traumatized, well, then, that's the end of things. That's just, it's a myth.
It is a myth. Okay, so what I want to do now is just play some of the voice notes we got from our brave listeners who are super generous about sharing the biographies with us. One of them, the first one is from a woman named Elizabeth from Winnipeg, Canada. She's estranged, I believe, but working her way back. And she talks a little bit about coping strategies. It's not a long note, but I'd like you to hear it, Josh, and then maybe we can talk about it for a minute. So this is Elizabeth from Winnipeg.
Hi, Trish. This is Elizabeth from Winnipeg, Canada. I walked away from my family about 10 years ago. I'm 49 years old. The idea about stepping away from your family, I agree. Sometimes you need time to reflect and heal from the damage that is done from your family. We have kind of reconnected a little bit by setting boundaries and doing all of that other stuff. I think sometimes when you reach adulthood, you learn about life and you learn about choices, and sometimes you can't agree with the choices that your family had made, but which has added healing in other aspects of my family. It's a very complicated subject, but the current ghosting of parents has been something that I've noticed as well, and it's so divisive. And the resilience, like you say, or the coping strategies is what I reflect back on all the time. The coping strategies seem to be gone in our society. I believe that the school systems and the systems around us, like the people that are supposed to be helping our children, are not giving those coping strategies to our children. My daughters are both, one's graduated and one's almost graduated. And I'm seeing that the coping strategies that I learned through my journey of stepping away from my family have made them into some phenomenal human beings in the way that they navigate through the world today. thank you as always for your podcasts. I find them fascinating and just love it. So thank you very much.
So that was Elizabeth, and she seemed to be saying a couple of things, that she was estranged, is no longer estranged, but she learned some things about resilience that maybe she could have learned by not estranging herself that are helping her daughters. What did you think of what she had to say? She was kind of agreeing with us too, wasn't she, on how kids are being taught to be helpless, right?
Yeah, I liked what Elizabeth had to say. And I mean, I'm certainly not advocating, and I doubt you are, that adult children who are considering estrangement have to just completely submit themselves to their parents. I mean, when I'm working with parents, I encourage parents to take responsibility, to make amends, to find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in their children's complaints, to be open to the adult child setting the terms of the relationship. So I'm certainly not advocating that adult children have to become more submissive to parents or family members that they find intrusive, hurtful, or destructive. And realistically, there are some parents who are so critical, hostile, shaming, humiliating, unrepentant, that it makes it hard for even me, who specializes in this, to encourage them to continue to kind of get back in the ring with parents who just, they're just too troubled to be able to have a relationship with that adult child in a way that's meaningful to them. Not meaningful, but isn't actually psychologically harmful to them. My concern in a general way, and my critique in a general way, is that our ideas of what is harmful, the bar for that has become so low that we assume that if somebody makes us feel bad or is upsetting to us or makes us feel guilty or anxious, then they're toxic or borderline or narcissistic and we should get rid of them. But one of the things that Elizabeth said was that, talking more about boundaries. And I think that boundaries are a reasonable topic for adult children to have with their parents, and kind of, letting them know in a kind and loving way why, when they communicate in a certain way, it does feel hurtful or wounding or shaming or guilt inducing, and trying to raise it in a way that makes the parent want to hear it. If an adult child starts off the conversation by saying, well, I learned in my therapy that you're a narcissist, probably not going to go real well. But if you start off by saying, look, there's a lot of things that I got from you as a parent that were valuable, or I know you really love me and you're dedicated, but there are some things in our relationship I'd like to work on. Are you open to that? And, not all parents are going to be able to go there, but a lot of them, would, particularly if they're facing estrangement. And this is the one pathway towards reconciliation.
That's very interesting. And the other thing, too, I would say, if asked, is that maybe mommy's a narcissist, which I think is the most overused word in the world. No question. Yeah. After toxic. Toxic is not one of my favorites either. Yeah. But maybe mommy is that way because grandpa was sort of a weirdo. And so there's a point, like with my own father, as how I started this, who was a violent drunk, probably because of his service in the war. He never talked about it. And I was estranged from him for like almost my whole adult life until he died of alcoholism. And I kind of regret that now. I wish I could have had a different, it was, what he was doing was horrific. I'm not exaggerating, but I still in my old age wish I had been able to find some grace almost in that religious way. We need to bring that to our relationships too, where, he's a total shit, but you can still love him, Yeah.
Well, right. We have to think about what do cultures do that are more Confucian in their orientation, or more interdependent and have ideas of filial obligation. They manage to do something with their feelings beyond just submit to them. So I agree with what you're saying, that, and this is the problem with a culture of individualism, is that there's nothing really in our societies that make that seem like a laudable thing to do. If anything, you're being codependent or weak, or you're not sufficiently assertive or evolved if you're going to just have a relationship with somebody who continues to behave in this problematic way. But I agree with you. What about bringing more compassion to it? And, certainly you can set limits and have boundaries around bad behavior, but also to understand that if a parent is behaving in a really difficult way, it's probably because of their own past and history, and they need some healing as well. So I think that's really the right way to go.
And that does not seem to be entering into a lot of, especially the conversations on YouTube right now. Wow. No one even talks about that. Okay. So I just want to mention one that we're not going to play because she asked for anonymity, but she's from Holland. And she talked about something I hear all the time, Josh, on this show, and that is estrangement over COVID policies.
Yep.
And she didn't say which ones. She didn't say if it was around the vaccine or extended lockdowns or masking or any of the things that have completely divided us as a culture. But boy, I get letters from people every week saying my mom doesn't talk to me, or my husband and I are on the verge of whatever. So what do we do about that? I mean, these are people who I guess did not have issues before COVID. I've seen it in my own, neighborhood, this kind of coming apart. So how do you breach that in which each side, I happen to think one side is right and one's wrong. I'm not going to say which one because it doesn't matter. But I can still be friends with people I don't agree with. And in fact, one of my kids was way more invested in the fear part of COVID than I would have liked, right? But we figured it out. Yeah. How do you come back together over an estrangement that maybe the person who is more on the COVID fear side of it is feeling virtuous about what they did, that not embracing even the most extreme examples of some of the public health measures. If you're not doing that, you're a bad person. How do you bring those people together again?
Well, I think it's tied to the political differences. It's in that same continuum that if you don't agree with my values, somehow you're not only have different values, but you're actually a bad person.
Yes.
And I think that you're never going to persuade somebody, like somebody who's more fearful of COVID. You're never going to persuade them that they shouldn't be. Similarly, somebody who's less fearful, we can't really assume we're going to be able to persuade anybody of anything. So I think trying to prioritize what's good in the relationship, trying to find shared values. So, for example, my younger brother is a serious conspiracy theorist. So like the worst. I mean, I love him, but he admits it. And I used to get into big fights with him about it and tell him how ridiculous he was being. And now he starts to go that I'm just like, we know these conversations don't go well.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something else. I love you. You love me. Let's talk about other things that you're doing, et cetera. So, I mean, trying to see if there's a way to compartmentalize it. Just, you're not going to persuade somebody. So don't even try to persuade them. And if you're going to, do it from a position of love and affection and interest, not from a position of contempt or criticality.
Yeah, exactly. And I may agree more with your brother, but there is a point in these relationships, I think, where you say, dude, I would be the one giving you a kidney if you were dying. So can we quit arguing about the vaccines or whatever? Like that, and that's the reality of family life, that we are people who would lay down our lives for the other, which is maybe the most important thing when you whittle it down. And we don't seem to see each other that way anymore, do we?
No, we don't. And and it's a concern. And so I think conversations like the one we're having are useful, because I think most people don't really know how much they're under the sway of these highly individualistic values and how much they inform their thoughts and feelings and orientations.
I blame in part politics for this, because the demonization of your opponent is so bad, because then you're also, and it's happened, you're demonizing the opponent's supporters and all of that, and that becomes acceptable. And can't we just get back to, well, I don't think we can get back to a time, I'm quite worried about it actually, because of the information silos we all live in now, right? But can't we just get back to a point where you say, I don't agree with that person's politics, but I know that this is a good person who, if I collapsed right now, would spend 20 minutes doing CPR to keep me alive. I mean, and maybe that's an extreme way to look at people you disagree with, but it's also maybe a good one too, right?
Right. Well, I share your pessimism about it, because the people who have the most power, whether it's power through wealth, like an Elon Musk, or power through politics, like it exists in our country and in many other countries, are very motivated to fan the flames of divisiveness, because those kinds of in-group identities are very powerful motivators at the poll. So I'm skeptical about that, and the way that social media can both be manipulated to a cause and be a source of manipulation is also a cause of great concern.
Yeah, I want so much for this to end. I have to tell you, I'm exhausted with it.
Yep.
And a lot of our listeners are exhausted, which is one of the reasons, like, I don't tend to do shows like this where we're really looking at some of the psychological and sociological underpinnings of where we are. But I think it's very important because, and for instance, COVID is kind of settled down a bit. And I have people writing to me saying, you know, my mom's still not talking to me, or, you know, it's just over that, really, like, it's just it's so terrible. Okay. So let's listen to, we have Cynthia now from Calgary, and she is a mom of 2 girls, one of whom she is estranged from and one of whom she is not. And she talks about the things one must navigate in that situation. And she's in Calgary, Alberta.
Hi, Trish. It's Cynthia calling from Calgary. This is my 3rd attempt at sending you this voicemail. I heard your plea for people to call in about estrangement. I am a mother of 2 beautiful girls. My oldest will be 40 this coming November, and my youngest just got married. She's 27 and now is also suffering from the estrangement of her older sister. I was a single mom with my oldest, originally from Montreal, moved to Calgary, had her, raised her pretty much on my own for the first 10 years of her life because her dad, an alcoholic and not a very nice person. I couldn't raise her under those circumstances, so I asked him to leave months before she turned 2. It was just her and we were a team. Every decision I made, every move that I made, and every school that she went to, we all know as parents that it does take a team. Those of us that were single moms, I had no family here, we end up stressing over sometimes the littlest things, but when you have someone else to discuss and review it with, it makes the decisions a little bit easier. But with her, she was my life. I was a school teacher, fortunate enough that I had summers off, and I would take her to Montreal, where I grew up, to be with my dad and my brothers, who were extremely strong, loving, caring, and supportive people. Long story short, she is married. I feel that her husband was perhaps the big influence on her estranging from the rest of us. I would listen to him and how he spoke to his own mother. That always sent shivers down my spine, but I never, ever once thought that she would back him up and leave her family behind. Almost 6 years ago now, she decided she no longer wanted a part of me. The problem that I faced with her was that I didn't hear it from her mouth. I got a phone call from her husband one very cold January 3rd morning, and he just yelled explicits on the phone and told me that I was an abusive mother and she's in therapy because I was such a bad mother, and that was the end of it. I never heard from her. There was no explanation as to what I had ever done to her. And I know that none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, but I do know in my heart of hearts that everything that I did for her was through love. Trying to get over this has been a huge struggle for me. I've gone to therapy. I have done just about everything that I could do in order to remind myself that this is not my problem. This is her problem. Her little sister, who just got married, she's 27. She now, if she meets people, she tells people she's an only child because the pain of having to repeat the story.
I do want to use that to really recognize she's in some pain.
Yeah.
And how difficult is this for the people, for the mums and the dads who are frozen out?
It's a nightmare. You know, they're miserable, they're depressed, they're suicidal. And there's so many, I have so many Cynthias in my practice. You know, she was a single mother. She raised her child gets married, and then it sounds like the husband turned her against her. And somebody who doesn't have experience in this might think, oh, she's just in denial about what a terrible parent she was. You know, well, maybe, but there are a lot of close relationships between parents and adult children that get ruined by a motivated son-in-law or daughter-in-law who may persuade that their spouse, the adult child, that they were abused or traumatized, or they may just adopt the policy of choose them or me. You can't have both. You know, I did a survey of 1,600 estranged parents through the University of Wisconsin Survey Center. And one of the things I found was that 70% of those who had an estrangement weren't estranged till their kid got married. So we know that marriage is a flashpoint, childbirth is a flashpoint. And I think the influence of a motivated, mentally ill or manipulative son-in-law or daughter-in-law is very, very high. But the other thing that that Cynthia's call highlights is kind of the question is what are parents owed? You know, if she was a single mother, she raised these two girls by herself, and you know, even if there were problems in the mother's mothering, for her to let her, you know, for the daughter to let her husband call the mother and yell at her and blame her and then cut her off and not give her any way to reconcile, no pathway towards healing the relationship. I just think that's wrong.
I believe that we would probably have to get pretty Buddhist in that situation, wouldn't we?
Yes.
You know, about the loving detachment stuff and all that. I don't know if I would survive that, especially if there were a false allegation made.
And right, exactly. And well, then, and here's the complicating thing also, Trish, and that is that there was an important study by the Australian psychologist Nick Haslam, where he talks about the notion of concept creep. And one of the things he found was that over the past 3 or 4 decades, there's been a lowering of the bar of what we consider abusive, harmful, neglectful, or traumatizing behavior. So a lot of adult children today are saying, well, you harmed me, you traumatized me, you abused me, et cetera. And the parents are like, what are you talking about? You know, I mean, you know, you had a pretty damn good childhood from my perspective. So often the generations are talking past each other. And part of my role is to help parents do the kind of code switching to be able to speak the language of their adult children. So I think that therapists often are adopting that language as well and saying, yes, that was a trauma. Yes, you were abused. That was emotionally abusive. And that really kind of greenlights a lot of these estrangements.
Wow. And so why do you think the bar has been lowered in the way you describe? Is that just something that happens within a profession culturally, or why has that happened?
I think it's partly the wedding between the pharmaceutical industry and the psychiatric community, where they were sort of keen to develop more and more diagnoses for what something that could be medicated. There's a number of different psychiatrists who've written about that. I think it's the way that more identitarian emphasis has been changing over the past period of time, where identity is much more powerful. So the ability to, for the adult child to kind of come at the parent or attack them or blame them or criticize them has become much more compelling and authoritative. And therapy is just completely, grown and sort of in every aspect of society. It's in the military, it's in the medical community. It's in just basically every form of society. So therapeutic narratives have become the way that we sort of understand ourselves and think about ourselves. And that's, it's historically somewhat new.
It's almost like a fashion accessory. I mean, and I sort of blame Harry for that. Everything's Harry's fault, Prince Harry.
Right.
But he was with Better Up, which I understand has crashed and burned. And I'm going to say something maybe mean, but it is brave of people to say stuff about their lives. And I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've got 23 years. I say it on my show all the time. Thank you. But I don't want to parade, but I do know that when I was drinking and struggling, hearing other people say I got better is what motivated me to get into AA. So that's what we try to do here. And so I think people talking about their mental health problems has the same effect, but there's kind of a point where you're going too far. Like it's narcissism now. I'm sick of it.
Yeah.
and he blames everything in his life on his mother's death, which is a ridiculous, his brother went through the same trauma and he seems to be doing okay. So, it's not good, I think, in the end for psychotherapy. It doesn't build the idea that you just sometimes have to get on with life in the best way you can.
Well, and that you can have a traumatic experience and still the probability is low that is going to persist with you years later. This kind of emotional determinism that's become so popular is basically wrong-headed. There's a great book by a University of Toronto psychiatrist. I forgot his name, but the book is called The Myths of Childhood. And one of the things that he points out over and over is you can have really dramatic signs of psychological dysfunction as an adult, and there still may not be a childhood trauma that underlies it. There are many, many pathways to adult dysfunction beyond psychological traumas, and there are many psychological traumas that don't have long-term sequelae of symptoms.
Yeah. Say one positive thing to me that our listeners who are estranged can hang on to if they're alone and struggling to make contact with their children.
Well, I think that the thing that I find the most helpful for parents is to really understand the way that the culture has changed. That the old idea of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, or the idea that you can use sort of guilt or obligation to motivate your child, that ship has sailed. We're now in an era of much more of a psychological orientation towards relationships. So it's critically important that if your adult child's complaining about you, criticizing you, about your parenting, even if you don't agree with it, to try to find the kernel of truth, to try to show empathy, to take responsibility, to not defend, to not explain. If you're a child saying you emotionally abused me and you don't have any belief that you did, it's far better to say, well, I don't remember behaving in that way, but it's clear I have significant blind spots that the behavior that I did caused you to feel that way. And I'm really sorry. And I'm interested in learning more. Would you be open to doing family therapy about it or telling me more about it? The goal, again, as with the political differences and the differences around COVID, is not to prove somebody wrong, particularly if you're a parent. It's to deepen understanding and empathy and show that you're somebody that they're kind of you're willing to do business with them in terms of developing a mutual understanding.
It's so extreme, this postmodern blob of you can't have any ideas about transsexualism that aren't exactly what we say or about, it's just so very, very dangerous. Lastly, and thank you so much for doing this. I'm very grateful. And you've lifted my spirits. Actually, it's good to talk to somebody who's been thinking critically about it. Okay. What would you say to me about my father? Should I'm now going to research his naval experience, which I've, avoided my whole adult life, but how should I do feel guilty for not being kinder. What would you say about that?
And your father's passed, Trish?
Oh, yeah. He died of alcoholism like 20 years ago.
I see. If you were my client, I would want you to work on your self-compassion and self-forgiveness and to know that at the time that you made the decision to cut off contact, you were doing what psychologically you felt like was the best thing for you to do, if not the only thing for you to do. And I think a lot of adult children who cut off their parents, that is what they think and feel. I think these kind of conversations are useful because we're sort of presenting other options, but I don't think that you had that option. And so I would want you to work on your self-compassion and self-forgiveness and not live in a place of feeling self-critical. There was an article I read recently by the psychoanalyst Hans Lowald, Loewald, and he talked about the importance of changing ghost into ancestors. And the idea is that when our family memories of hurtful families still affect us, they're really ghosts. They haven't really found a home yet. And the goal is to settle them into ancestors where they're the feelings are resolved and they're in the past and they live in the past. They don't live in the present. So
I love that. And I think maybe in closing, can we encourage people even who are having some difficult parents? I had difficult parents, but you can, with help, can't you even navigate that in a way that maybe you don't have to sacrifice time with them, right? That's not the only solution, is it?
No, it isn't the only solution. And I think boundaries are a reasonable thing, and setting the terms and all of that are useful. But sometimes you just kind of have to accept that your parents are highly flawed people and they genuinely did the best they could. It's not really an excuse, but it's a reality. And to come from a position of compassion, because coming from a position of compassion is actually a much nicer place to live.
Yeah.
I mean, in an evaluative way, but it's just if you feel better coming from a position of compassion than of criticality or contempt or, that kind of thing.
I bet if these kids were doing a loving kindness meditation before a lunch with mom and dad, this whole thing would be finished. It'd be better. It might be just that shift, where you're looking at them differently, right? It's amazing.
Right. No, I totally agree with you.
Anyway, you are a peach, as we say. Thank you so much. I know this will help so very many people. And you know what? It certainly helped me. I was really struggling when I discovered this phenomenon. I think you're right. There is an element of social contagion, and the internet and social media are the devil. And I just think we need to be kinder to our parents, don't you? Yeah.
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was a really, really great conversation.
Thanks very much. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
So that was Dr. Coleman. Astonishing trend that's happening in our culture right now. And you know what? It's not happening in other places that don't live the way we do. Other countries that value family relationships, that therapists aren't saying to kids, cut your parents off. They're narcissists. They're terrible. They're not doing that. It's like anti-survival of the human race. That is what that is. So his book is called Rules of Estrangement. And if you're going through this, maybe you might want to pick it up. And also feel free, if you have anything more to say about this, to post on Trish Wood Podcast voice notes, and we'll play some, and I'll certainly listen to them as well. Here we go. Little bit of a smoking gun here, people. Published May 17th, 2018. Written by David Pugliese, Ottawa citizen. Canadian government comes to the defense of Nazi SS and Nazi collaborators, but why? In late April, more than 50 members of the U.S. Congress condemned the government of Ukraine's ongoing efforts to glorify Nazi collaborators. The letter, signed by both Republican and Democrats, outlined concerns about ongoing ceremonies to glorify leaders of the Ukrainian insurgent army, as well as the 14th SS Galician Division. This is the one that Hunka was involved in. It's particularly troubling that much of the Nazi glorification in Ukraine is government-supported, noted the letter to U.S. Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan, who's currently, I think, mucking around in there still. The letter was initiated by Democratic reps Ro Khanna of California and David Cicciolini of Rhode Island. Now, let me just stop there. Not to toot my own horn, but sometimes it does need tooting. When the Ukraine war started, you may recall I did 2 or 3 or 4 shows with people who I admired, some from Consortium News. Patrick Lawrence was one. We had another academic. I was quoting John Mearsheimer, did a big essay about this, and also Oliver Stone, about how there were Nazis still in Ukraine, and that when Putin said he was talking about the denazification of Ukraine, all the Western media said he was lying. And we actually lost some listeners over it. I got some really mean I shouldn't say mean. That's not fair. I can take it. Don't worry about me. But let's say angry emails from people saying, I'm Ukrainian and you can't say that and Russia's bad. And I never supported the invasion, and I made that really clear. But what I was talking about was that, as all things in life right now, it wasn't that simple as Ukraine good and Russia bad. Ukraine is a country that's hugely corrupt. Ukraine is a country that harbored Nazis. Ukraine is a country where some of the people fighting Russians, namely the Azov Battalion, are actually Nazi sympathizers. And our Canadian military were training them. So and also Russia invaded. I don't agree with it, because we broke a promise to them during the Glasnost negotiations to end the Cold War, that we said, we will not let Ukraine join NATO because you don't want weapons on your back doorstep. We said that. We all said it. And then Biden comes into office and they're like, oh, well, let's start talking about, NATO. Really? That's kind of what happened. And then just before I go on, there were a number of opportunities for peace. Agence France-Presse reported early on that there were talks. They could have ended it. It's a meat grinder killing tens of thousands of people in the worst possible way, funded by us. No one's caring about where the money's going. Zelensky's getting villas all over the place. I mean, it's an absolute, may I say it, shit show over there right now. So we were reporting on that when it happened, and now we've come full circle. And this is the outcome. So this article from 2018, the media was happy to say that there were Nazis in Ukraine. Once we started fighting or supplying Ukraine with weapons, then the propaganda changed and we could never say there was a Nazi in Ukraine. That all of a sudden was bad, right? Contrast that to how the Canadian government handled a related issue last year, when the Russian embassy in Ottawa tweeted out that there are monuments to Nazi collaborators in Canada and nobody's doing anything about it. Look at all the stuff they pulled down because of, whatever, colonization or whatever, right? Down in an instant. But Nazis, leave them alone. That's fine. A monument in Oakville commemorates those who served with the 14th SS Galician Division. Another monument in Edmonton honors Roman Shukevich, the leader of the Ukrainian insurgent army. As my post-media colleague Marie Danielle Smith discovered, the Russian tweet sent bureaucrats at Global Affairs Canada into overdrive as they tried to defend the SS unit and Ukrainian Nazi collaborators. Documents she received through the Access to Information Law showed government officials were under a lot of pressure from the center, meaning the Privy Council and the Prime Minister's office, to counter the news about the monuments to Nazi collaborators. The bureaucrats came up with a strategy. They would label the tweet as disinformation, and they came up with a plan to spread the word to the news media as part of their efforts to defend Ukraine's Nazi collaborators. Now, just let me refresh your memory that Trudeau's first response to that shame they perpetrated in the House last week was that it was, guess what? Russian disinformation. So this is an old strategy that they use to protect Nazis. It's right here. And this is legacy media right here. Okay. Now, as I have written before, the Russians are more than happy to try to embarrass the Canadian government, which has steadfastly stood behind the Ukrainian government in the ongoing conflict in the region. Suggesting that Canada allows monuments to Nazi collaborators seems to fit that bill. So he's acknowledging that, yes, Russia does use propaganda like all governments, including our own. But in this case, the Russian tweets aren't fake news or disinformation. They are accurate. As those members of the U.S. Congress have pointed out, the Ukrainians who served in the SS Galician Division were indeed Nazi collaborators, and so too was Roman Shukevich. Now, this is shocking. Before going to the Ukrainian insurgent army, Shukevich was commander of the Ukrainian battalion called Nakhchigal. I may be mispronouncing it, forgive me. The men of Nakhchigal rounded up Jews in Lviv in June 1941, massacring men, women, and children. The Simon Wiesenthal Center estimates that this battalion, along with their German military counterparts, managed to murder around 4,000 Jews in Lviv. Other historians put the estimates at 6,000. Okay? Statues to these people. Shukevich was later assigned to a new unit whose role in Germany's war, according to one Holocaust expert, was fighting partisans and killing Jews. Now, apparently he later turned against the Nazis. That's what it says. Then there is the SS Galician Division. They were eager Nazi collaborators. Some 80,000 Ukrainians volunteered to join the SS, but only those who could meet the strict requirements were selected. The SS used some of its most seasoned killers to oversee the development of its new division. SS General Jürgen Stroop, who would later be executed as a war criminal for his brutal destruction of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, was brought on as an advisor. Other commanders of the division were all versed in the murder of Jews throughout the occupied territories in Eastern Europe. Many of the Ukrainian officers, like SS Hauptstmerführer Michael Brigidreier, I hope, had previously served in SS Skuma battalions, routinely used to kill partisans, burn down villages, and, when the opportunity arose, murder Jews, end quote, wrote award-winning author Christopher Hill in his 2011 groundbreaking book, Hitler's Foreign Executioners. And that paragraph sits above a photograph taken in July 21st, 2013. Yevhen Kutsik, 86, a former member of the SS Galician Division, is shown laying a wreath at a monument to SS Galician. He is accompanied by a young Ukrainian nationalist wearing a white pride t-shirt. SS Galician Division was used by the Nazis in a variety of operations, one of the most controversial being the 1944 destruction of the village of Huta Pieniacka. Huta Pieniacka was considered a Polish village that just months before had been the shelter for several hundred Jews, Hale noted. The SS units surrounded the village. Men, women, and children who had taken refuge in the village church were taken outside in groups and murdered. Kids were executed in front of their parents, their heads smashed against tree trunks, one witness testified. Others were burned alive in houses. Around 850 people were murdered. Some Ukrainians dispute that the SS Galician Division took part in the killings, or they argue that only a small element from the unit and under Nazi command were involved. A Ukrainian military board heard testimony in 1944 that members of the Galician Division did take part in the attack, but that action was justified, the board was told, since the inhabitants of Huta Pieniacka had been killing Ukrainian peasants. By the way, the Jews were hiding in the village, a Ukrainian officer added in his testimony describing the destruction of village inhabitants. Some Ukrainians see Shukevich and SS Galician Division members as heroes. They see them as heroes. We saw them as heroes in the House of Commons last week. They argue that those individuals served the Nazis because they saw them as liberators from the Russians. Their ultimate goal was an independent Ukraine. But to claim that these individuals were not Nazi collaborators is something else. They served Hitler. So this is what's really going on here, people. Zelensky knows it. He hasn't apologized, has he? Did you see that photograph of Chrystia Freeland swooning into his arms in Ottawa? She knows all this stuff. She's Ukrainian. She knows it. She knows her own history. So what is really going on here? We deserve an open inquiry into who knew what when, so that they cannot slither away from this. In May 1944, SS leader Heinrich Himmler addressed the Ukraine SS recruits in a speech. Your homeland has become more beautiful since you have lost on our initiative, I must say. The residents who were so often a dirty blemish on Galicia's good name, namely the Jews, said Himmler. I know that if I ordered you to liquidate the Poles, I would be giving you permission to do what you are eager to do anyway. Himmler's speech was greeted with cheers from the Ukrainian recruits. Equally disturbing are the details contained in the book, The Holocaust Chronicle, published in 2003 and written by 7 top scholars in the field of Holocaust studies. They noted that Ukrainian SS were also sent to help kill Jews during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The Chronicle published a photo of 2 Ukrainian SS members standing over the bodies of Jews murdered during that uprising. But this issue of Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis is not new. Since 1986, the Nazi hunters with the Simon Wiesenthal Center have warned about efforts from those in Ukraine and in the Ukrainian community in Canada who want to deny involvement of the SS Galician Division with the Nazis. I mean, this is just mind-boggling. So I am going to post this whole thing on my Substack. They're not going to get away with it. And you must call your MPs. And you must speak out about it, because this is not who we are. And we live in a time now, and that's why I'm quite emotional about this, because we live in a time where history is distorted, where lies are told, where politicians get away with the most grotesque falsehoods in order to further whatever agenda they have at the moment. And we cannot let them do this. They knew. There were people who knew. Chrysler Freeland knew. Trudeau probably knew as well. I mean, how could he not? If he knew that they were protecting these statues in 2018, coming from the PMO, this article says, why would he do that? Why are we tearing down other statues for other politically expedient reasons, but not these ones, which represent the deepest, darkest evil really ever known to mankind? I don't understand it. It's not who we are. They don't represent who we are, and we cannot let it stand. So I want to end just by doing something that everybody's going to be mad at me about. I don't care. It is a note I found, was actually sent to me from the Russian embassy to the Canadian government. So this is the ambassador of Russia's statement. His name is Oleg V. Stepanov. And I know we're supposed to hate all Russians always till the end of time. I mean, it's ridiculous. People stop playing Tchaikovsky over the invasion of Ukraine. It's just total brainwashing. Of course, the war is bad, but let's not erase history either. The Prime Minister's apology, which we heard today in the House of Commons, is not an apology, and it's not enough. My country was the main force in defeating Nazi Germany in Europe during World War II. Russia-USSR losses were devastating. 11 million military personnel fell on the battlefields, and 16 million civilians died due to the ethnic purges under the Nazi occupation at the hands of the SS, including the notorious 14th Division of the SS Galicia death squads, Einsatzgruppen, and Nazi collaborators. Imagine, this is the combined current population of Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia provinces. There are more than 200,000 Canadians of Russian descent. All of them are legal citizens, loyal voters, and taxpayers. Every Russian family, including Russian Canadians, lost at least one relative in combating Nazism. I strongly believe that despite deep disagreements between Moscow and Ottawa on the current geopolitical situation, the government and the Parliament of Canada must find courage to apologize directly to all Russians and the Russian Canadian community for the disgraceful incident in the whole world. For the disgraceful incident the whole world was watching on September the 22nd. I agree. I know people won't like that because we all have to hate everything Russian, but I agree. He's right. Sorry. So let's end the show with a little bit of grace and beauty after all of that horror. I'm sorry, but I had to do it. Someone has to react with appropriate emotional responses to what just happened in our country. And I wouldn't be doing my job here if I didn't. And I couldn't be any other way either. It's just who I am. So, but look, the world is still full of grace and beauty. Remember my interview with Jeffrey Tucker, who finally got out of his COVID funk by listening to Mahler. Not my thing. Mahler is not my thing, but it worked for him. And music also works for me. I have different tastes than Jeffrey does. I talked about Tears for Fears, but I did discover this magnificent thing on YouTube the other day. And I'm going to play a little bit of it for you. I hope it doesn't get me in trouble. I'm claiming fair use here. And it is Gary Brooker from Procol Harum with the Danish National Concert Orchestra and a massive choir doing the most brilliant interpretation of Whiter Shade of Pale ever. 94 million views so far. And it's enough if you just sit with it for a minute, people. Listen to the strings, the way they come in. Listen to Gary Brooker's voice. This was in 2006, so he was old, and he still could do it. Listen to his voice, and then wait for it when that absolutely brilliant, iconic organ solo riff comes in. Then you can actually believe, yes, life is worth living. You know, when people can create this kind of music and then make it even better so many years later with a symphony and chorus, I was just blown away by it. I might actually listen to this now twice a week. I'm going to put it on my diary to just kind of plug into Whiter Shade of Pale with the Danish Concert Orchestra, 2006, Gary Brooker, lead singer, great voice still. He died relatively recently, which is a huge drag, but he was in fine form. And maybe this little piece of music will restore us to a little bit of fine form. Not until we sort this out, but it lifts us. It exists in the world. We have to remember that. And to all of you angry kids who might be angry at me now for not siding with you against your parents, I meant what I said about doing a loving kindness meditation, learning some resilience around how to deal with difficult people, not ones who are knocking you around. I mean, of course, that's extreme, but an existence without conflict and without growth and without overcoming and learning things is not an existence either. So all of this drawing of boundaries stuff and everybody's a narcissist and blah, blah, it's not, unless your mother is actually a female version of our prime minister, you've probably got nothing to worry about. So try and see if there's a way that you can, in small steps, reconcile with the help of a therapist who isn't all in on estranging families. They exist, and you may find someone by actually buying Dr. Coleman's book, but walking away from your family, unless they're terrible, unless they're the Munsters or something. Well, they were actually pretty kind, but you know what I mean. Texas Chainsaw, let's say that. Unless they're really terrible, it's, in my opinion, I'm not a doctor. I'm just old and smart. Sometimes it's better to take the Buddhist way and kind of lovingly detach emotionally so that you can physically be there for them. I regret my estrangement from my father. That's what I'm telling you. In my olden years, I regret it. I wish I'd been kinder, and I wish I'd worked on my own resilience. And I will also say this, that my walking away from that now feels a little bit selfish. I know we're not supposed to say that, like we're trying to find our truth, but it does feel selfish. I regret it. And so for what it's worth, or just tell me I'm full of it and you hate me and you're not going to listen to the show, that's fine too. I'd be sad, but I'd get over it. And maybe the place we can all come together is with Gary Brooker and Procol Harum. I believe that. It's true. So here it is. Stay critical, and I'll see ya.
We skip the life and tango, we turn cartwheels across the floor. I was feeling kind of seasick, but the crowd called out for more. The room was humming harder, as the ceiling flew away. When we called out for another drink, the waiter brought a tray. And so it was, little later, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned